Hi, my name is Rob Nelson and I'm the author and creator of Sagelight Image Editor, and today what I want to show you is a tutorial of how to use the bokeh and lens blur functions in Sagelight. When you first come into the bokeh and lens blur function, and I want to make sure that I point out that I say bokeh and lens blur, because a lot of what you want to do is a lens blur, which is really just a shape blurred. You can see that you have these different shapes which really are mimicking the aperture shape of your camera, circle, octagon, hexagon, and then various other shapes. And so when you first come into the bokeh, you have a default setting where you can then move it around, and you can see that you can work with this in real time. Now I chose this picture. This is really part one of 3 parts of a planned tutorial, where this is really what you might call the quintessential bokeh picture, because it's dark and it has light, and you can see that as you increase the highlights you can really bring them out, and then you can change the shape of the aperture to do different things with the bokeh. And so this picture is really a typical example that you see a lot, but it's by far the only type of picture that you can do with the bokeh. In fact, if you've seen some of the other introduction videos that I have, you see that I'm using quite a wide range of pictures for the examples, and I want to make sure I do that on purpose. So I guess I'm making this statement here just so that you'll know that I'm using this for the purpose of an example, and then I'm going to get to other types of pictures that you can use with the bokeh. It's just that since this has the specular reflective qualities and all that to it, it really makes a good example. So if I press reset to get back to the main image, I can go ahead and get back to where I was. And what I want to show you is this reticle right here. You can see that I've already been moving it around, and you can see that it moves around in real time, so I can really see what I'm doing. And so what I can do is I can expand it, or I can shrink it, but also I can change the shape. So if I want to square, I can do that, or make it into a rectangle. And so if I want to do kind of this one works pretty well for distance shots where you're trying to do the depth of field before and after into the distance. You can also do the dual planar one where you can rotate it. And you see it's pretty easy to manipulate on the screen. And so you can see that I'm blurring into the background, or I can blur into the foreground, or do both depending on what I want to do. And I can do all sorts of various things. In fact, I can do a circle where I'm actually blurring inside the circle now, which can really help with different types of pictures. For this particular picture, I'm just going to go ahead and stay with the circle. And you can see that I've really increased the blur amount, which is one of the controls. You can see as I increase the control that I can really change the blur, and then I can also increase the highlights and do all sorts of interesting things with this picture. I can also go in and I can add saturation to just the parts that are being blurred without touching the area that's not being blurred. So another thing I can do is I can change the shape of the aperture, and so you can see that I can have these hollowed shapes where the triangles can tend to look kind of nice sometimes, or the diamond, or I can even do kind of a motion blur sort of sense with it, and then I can also change the how that looks. And you can see what happens is that, and so I can do that, and I can come back to the circle or the hollow circle. I tend to like the octagon shape for some reason. It reminds me of my camera, my old film camera. And what you can see is that if I want to get this blur, like with this particular blur, what I might want is to bring down the softness and the amount of the blur. And I may want to have this area blurred back here, but I don't necessarily want to have this foreground area blurred. I tend to like to use the circle, where a lot of other people might use the planar one, where you can just kind of blur evenly into the background. In fact, I'll go ahead and use that one for now. And as you can see, what happens is, and this is a typical thing that happens with bokeh. I think I called this the quintessential bokeh picture, and it kind of is, but it still has issues with, here's the background area and here's the background area, but the foreground area is sharing the same space in a two-dimensional picture. So to blur the background, I have to blur the foreground too. In Sagelight, the masking for the bokeh and lens blur is pretty easy, and a lot of times what you'll see with other videos and that sort of thing is you'll see a pre-made mask, because masking has traditionally been difficult, or traditionally is difficult. Where in the Sagelight functions, you can see I already had to replace this video, so I I'm recording this, where in this Sagelight bokeh function, you can edit the mask while you're in the function. So you don't have to be intentional, and you don't have to take a lot of time. The blur functions are designed around having a mask that does not have to be precise to every detail. So in this particular one, you can see that I'm not even zooming in. In reality, I mean, I might zoom in a little bit, but for demonstration purposes, I want to show where I can basically just do this mask. And what you'll see is that I'm not really going to do all of it. I'm only going to do part of it. I'm being a little intentional, but I'm not being overly careful either. And so what you'll see is when I press accept, suddenly that area is masked now. Where if I disable the mask, you can see that it blurs the foreground area, and then when I enable the mask, that I did a pretty good job. I didn't really have to worry about it too much. And what I might want to do is go in later and do a little touch-ups. And that's really why it's so easy, because the main rule in editing a mask inside the Bokeh lens blur function is really just do what you need to do. Just do what you see and don't worry about the rest, because you can do it so fast and you can get a real-time feedback interactively that you can just do a coarse mask and then make little adjustments on the hotspots later. For example, in this one, I see a couple things that I might want to do. I might want to take care of this arm area here. So what I can do is I can come in and simply just add a little bit more to it. And then also what I was seeing is on the shoulder, I really feel like maybe I went a little bit overboard. So what I can do is I can subtract a little bit on that, and then when I press accept, you can see that it's starting to look a little bit better. And when I say just do what you see, you can see that right here, for example, it's still a little blurry. So what I want to do is I want to edit the mask and do a little bit more down here. But I don't really have to do too much, because let me get the right brush size here. I don't have to do too much because it doesn't blur all the way down. It's very heavy in the blur here, but down here the blur really starts to dissipate. So I can create a mask that is really not that detailed. And again, when I press accept, you can see that, okay, this time I did it just fine where the mask is still hitting that. Still blurring here, but now suddenly it's not blurring on the edge of the coat like it was just a second ago. So you can see I'm just really hitting the hot spots. Like I can see a little area here that I want to deal with, and what I can do is I can make a small brush size. Normally I'd want to zoom in maybe a little bit more, and then I want to subtract from the mask, and then maybe just kind of hit that little hot spot there. So then when I press accept, suddenly it looks fine. Maybe I have another one. That's the nice thing about the zoom too, is it goes back to exactly where you were. So if I want to subtract a little bit here, for example, I can see that it's really starting to look much better. And so as I go further, what I can do is I can say, okay, if I want to do more, for example, you can see that, let's say I wanted to blur the whole thing, suddenly I need to deal with this area. I'm going to want to edit the mask. This overlay issue is the video recorder. It doesn't have anything to do with Sagelight. And so I can just edit it, the mask, where I see the difficulties. And so the thing is that you can see that I probably would want to do a better job, but this really isn't looking realistic. I wouldn't want to do that. That's why this auto mask comes in handy, because it allows me to really do a mask that doesn't have to be accurate, doesn't have to be detailed, doesn't have to take an hour. I can spend just a few minutes on it and get what I want. So for example, if I have a circle area, I can just move in there, and because I'm fading it into the background, that's why I don't have to be incredibly accurate with my mask. There are times where you're going to want to be more accurate, and then what you can do is you can just edit it as you go along to get the finer points of it. But for this particular case, for example, you don't really need to do really any more than I already did. So now what I can do is I can play with the highlights. I'm going to show the highlight mask in a separate video. This is part one of really 3, maybe even 4 parts. What I can do now is I can go ahead and increase the highlights. Like I said, this is kind of the quintessential kind of typical example that you might want to see, where the highlights are not, where they're really just behaving. You can see that as I move them out, they can really blow out. They actually can look pretty interesting. You can do quite a bit with it. And I can also use the highlight clip to help bring back the highlights. You can see that's a very interesting effect there. And I'm going to cover how the highlight masking works in a separate video, but I'm going to go ahead and bring the highlights out a little bit. And this is where you can also see the shape change. And so you can see that I can even do kind of a starry shape, which looks very interesting, or I can do the motion blur, which really without the highlights, the motion blur looks pretty interesting, but with the motion blur, with the highlights, the motion blur even gets that much more interesting. And so you can see that you can do quite a few different effects just by changing the blur shape, the highlights, and the blur amount, and all the other variables. So if I come back to kind of a normal, maybe a photorealistic, as it were, place, another thing I can do too is that, let's say I have this as an edgy sort of picture. And you can see I have, this is kind of an interesting effect too, but what I can also do is I can soften the amount of, I can soften the shape so that it's not so edgy. So if I have a very specific shape that I'm doing and I don't want it to be as pronounced, I can soften the aperture shape, which can be a very interesting effect as well. So you can see with the motion blur, it really just does have a different effect when you soften it up, and you can also increase the highlights strength as you go to do just various things. Another thing that you can do too is, let me get back to something fairly, again, photorealistic. I'm going to explain the specular edge in a separate video, and so here I have this picture here. Maybe I'll do an octagon shape, and what I can do is I can increase the color. In fact, I think I already did that. And so here's what the picture looks by itself. And here I can increase the overall color of the picture, which looks interesting. But another thing I can do is I can just increase the areas that are blurred. And so this isn't the best example. I'll show this in another example where this really only affects the area that is being blurred without affecting the entire picture. Because sometimes if you do the entire picture, you can see it gets very overwhelming. Everything's all colorful now, where especially when you have the specular highlight, sometimes you just want to increase the highlight areas, and then you can see it's leaving the foreground alone. And that can be a really powerful tool. In fact, I can, you can see that I can even make the highlight areas pale to make it more, maybe kind of a, looks more like a morning shot instead of a nighttime shot now. And this ends up being a good combination that you can play with, or you can just take out the color altogether. And so this concludes part one of the tutorial. In the next tutorial, I'll get to what the specular edge does, the light and darken slider, particularly this backlight slider, because it's a very powerful tool in the bokeh functions, as well as, and I'll also get to what the color edge does. And you can see as I move the color edge, it changes how the reflections look, and also the highlights masking. So thanks for listening, and hopefully this has helped you to use the bokeh and lens blur functions in an even better way.